It began on an ordinary morning in the kind of neighborhood where nothing extraordinary ever happens. The lawn's perfect, the mailboxes polished, the smiles rehearsed. Mark Lawson was making his coffee, humming quietly to himself, when his world simply stopped. A shattering mug, a scream, and then silence. While he lay in a hospital bed, trapped between life and death, his wife Laura refused to leave his side. Every day, she whispered his name, begged him to come back, and prayed their home would be waiting for him when he did. But outside that hospital, another story was unfolding. One that no one could have imagined. The HOA that promised to protect community values had set its sights on the Lawsons' home. Over $1,200 in unpaid landscaping fees, the kind of thing any neighbor could have forgiven, became their weapon. Letters were sent. Fines piled up. And when no one answered because no one could, the HOA made its move. In the time it took Mark to fight for his life, they fought for his house. For $100,000 of love, memories, and family. Sold off for $15,000 at a quiet little auction no one told Laura about. The ink dried while her husband's heart monitor beeped softly in the background. And when Mark finally opened his eyes months later, he didn't know that everything he'd built, everything he'd lived for, was already gone. This is the story of how a family lost their home not to thieves, not to disaster, but to greed, wrapped in legal language and sealed with a signature. You won't believe what this HOA did. While this man fought for his life. It started in the middle of a morning that felt like any other. Maple Ridge Estates was quiet, the kind of street where people waved politely, lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. Mark Lawson, 48, veteran firefighter and devoted father, was sipping his coffee in the kitchen, flipping through the local news on his tablet. His wife, Laura, moved about the house, folding laundry, checking on their teenage son Evan, who was sprawled on the couch, earbuds in, music blaring softly. The day held no indication that everything was about to change. Mark laughed at something Evan said, a joke about his untidy hair, and raised his coffee cup toward his wife. "You two are going to keep me on my toes until I'm 90, aren't you?" he said with a grin. Laura smiled back, tossing a sock into the laundry basket with precision. "I promise I'll still nag you when you're 90, she replied, and Evan rolled his eyes in mock annoyance. It was a moment of ordinary happiness, a snapshot of a family that had worked hard to build a life together. Then, in an instant, it all shattered. Mark's hand jerked, spilling the coffee across the counter. He clutched his chest, trying to speak, but the words came out garbled and incoherent. His eyes widened with fear and confusion. "Laura," he tried to say, but it was cut short by a sudden collapse. The sound of his body hitting the floor seemed to echo through the otherwise peaceful house. Laura screamed, running to his side. "Mark! Mark! Oh my God! Someone help!" Her voice was filled with panic and disbelief, the kind of desperation that only comes when the person you love most in the world is suddenly gone. Evan leapt to his feet, fumbling with his phone. "I'm calling 911, he shouted, his fingers trembling. The sound of his mother's sobs, the beeping of the alarm, the crashing of the coffee mug. Everything became a chaotic symphony of fear. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, lights flashing and sirens piercing the calm of Maple Ridge Estates. Paramedics rushed through the front door, gently but urgently maneuvering Mark onto a stretcher. Laura held his hand, refusing to let go, whispering over and over, "Please, come back to me. Please, just wake up." In the hospital, the atmosphere was stark, sterile, and suffocating. The soft hum of machines, the faint shuffle of nurses' shoes on tile, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor became the background soundtrack to Laura's life. Mark was stabilized but unresponsive, trapped between life and death. Doctors spoke in low, careful tones, delivering information that was both hopeful and terrifying. "He's critical," they said. "The stroke was severe, but he's stable. We need to monitor him closely." Words that should have comforted Laura only heightened her anxiety. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Laura hardly left the hospital room, sleeping in a stiff chair beside Mark's bed, surviving on coffee and sheer determination. Evan tried to manage school and home, balancing homework with hospital visits, the stress written on his young face. Meals were skipped, showers delayed, and life outside the hospital became a distant memory. And yet, amidst all of this, the ordinary world kept moving on. Bills arrived. Mail piled up. One letter in particular would prove to be the spark that ignited a nightmare. It was from the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. A thin, white envelope, stamped and official. Inside was a notice of a $200 landscaping fine. The grass had grown a little taller than allowed, the mulch a little faded. Minor infractions that any reasonable neighbor might have overlooked. But the HOA was not reasonable. Laura saw the letter once, glanced at it and set it aside. She had bigger concerns. Her husband's life was hanging by a thread. The notice seemed almost irrelevant in the face of such crisis. She didn't know it yet, but ignoring that letter would set the stage for the most shocking violation of trust her family would ever face. As weeks passed, more letters arrived. The fines increased, accumulating steadily, quietly. $200 became $400, then $800, and eventually $1,200. Still, no one in the Lawson household acknowledged them. The letters sat unopened among sympathy cards and hospital bills, an invisible ticking clock. Outside, the lawns of Maple Ridge Estates remained pristine. Neighbors waved, smiled, and went about their business, oblivious to the storm brewing on the Lawson property. Gerald Fox, the HOA president, was a man who measured the worth of a home in inches of grass and compliance with bylaws. He noticed the Lawsons' yard, overgrown and imperfect, as he patrolled the neighborhood in his golf cart. To him, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a violation. He scribbled notes, filed reports, and sent notice after notice. Compassion, in Gerald's mind, had no place where rules could be enforced. The irony was brutal. While a family fought for the life of their father and husband, the HOA methodically began the process of stripping them of their home. Inside the clubhouse, Gerald met with the board. 5 members, all similarly obsessed with order and control, reviewed the Lawson file. The discussion was clinical, detached, even cold. Unpaid fees totaling $1,200, Gerald stated, his voice crisp, final. Foreclosure procedures may begin after 90 days of delinquency. It's in the bylaws. A board member hesitated. But isn't he in the hospital? Shouldn't we? Gerald's interruption was swift. Personal matters are irrelevant. Rules are rules. The motion passed unanimously. In that moment, the fate of the Lawson family home was sealed, and they didn't even know it. Meanwhile, inside the hospital room, Laura clung to hope. Mark's fingers twitched slightly, a small but miraculous sign of life. Nurses rushed in, equipment beeped faster, and for the first time in weeks, Laura allowed herself to believe he might recover. She whispered his name, stroked his hair, begged him to fight. It was a moment of triumph, fragile and fleeting, unaware that at that exact time, a legal machine was moving forward to take their home from them. The next months were a blur of hospital visits, rehabilitation plans, and medical consultations. Laura balanced exhaustion with determination. Evan, quiet but observant, grew into a young man forced to shoulder responsibilities far beyond his years. He mowed the lawn when he could, watered plants, and tried to keep some sense of normalcy for the day they would bring their father home. Yet, every effort was undermined by an institution that didn't see humanity, only compliance. Letters turned into legal notices. Notices turned into a lien. The house was scheduled for auction. The date set quietly, without the family's knowledge. Gerald and his board continued their process, confident that no one would challenge them. The Lawsons, fighting a battle for life, had no time to fight for their home. The contrast was stark. Inside a sterile hospital room, a man slowly regained consciousness and the use of his fingers. Outside, his home was being signed over to strangers, sold for a fraction of its worth. $400,000 reduced to $15,000. Every memory, every birthday party, every quiet Sunday morning, erased with the stroke of a pen. The day Mark opened his eyes, he did not yet know the magnitude of what had happened. His first words were weak but determined. "Can we go home?" Laura's heart soared with hope, her voice trembling as she replied, "Soon, honey, soon." But their home was no longer theirs. Locks had been changed, boxes of belongings removed. The auction had concluded, the paperwork signed, and the Lawsons were left to confront a reality more devastating than any illness. Their life's work had been taken from them without warning, over $1,200 in minor fees. Shocked and grief-stricken, Laura began the search for answers. She called the HOA, confronted Gerald Fox, and received a response that was chilling in its detachment. "Rules are rules," he said. There was no empathy, no acknowledgement of the human suffering that had accompanied the alleged violations. It was clear that in Maple Ridge Estates, compliance mattered more than compassion. The family's trust had been betrayed, their security stripped away, and the very community they had believed in had turned against them. At the same time, the mechanics of the law began to reveal holes in the HOA's process. Attorneys were consulted, documents reviewed, and it became apparent that the proper procedures had not been followed. Notices had been sent but never received. Deadlines had been enforced with ruthless precision, while statutory obligations designed to protect homeowners were ignored. The stage was set for a battle that would pit a grieving family against an organization empowered by bureaucracy and emboldened by greed. Evan, observing his mother's relentless drive to reclaim their home, grew more determined with each passing day. He learned that the system could be manipulated, that those entrusted with authority could act in bad faith. The lesson was harsh, but it forged in him a resolve that would become critical in the months to come. Laura, meanwhile, balanced exhaustion with strategic determination, coordinating legal counsel, gathering evidence, and documenting every interaction with the HOA. Every unanswered letter, every broken promise, every procedural error became ammunition for the fight ahead. The chapter of the family's life that had begun with laughter in a sunlit kitchen had transformed into a struggle of survival. Not against illness alone, but against institutional indifference. The story of Mark, Laura, and Evan was no longer just about recovery. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was theirs, about facing the harsh truth that the world sometimes moves forward without concern for fairness or humanity. The stakes were high, the opposition was powerful, and the emotional toll was immense. Yet, even in this darkness, the first glimmers of determination began to shine, hinting at the resilience that would drive them through the battles ahead. Months passed, and the Lawsons' journey became a test of endurance. The hospital visits continued, rehabilitation progressed, but the shadow of the foreclosure loomed larger each day. Every piece of mail, every phone call, every knock at the door carried the potential for further shock. The auction, though complete, had yet to leave its mark fully. The family had to discover the theft for themselves. That moment, when they would finally confront the magnitude of what had been taken, would ignite a fire that no law, no procedure, and no bureaucratic indifference could extinguish. The realization would be crushing, but it would also be the catalyst for action, for accountability, for exposing the corruption hidden behind the pristine fences and manicured lawns of Maple Ridge Estates. By the time Mark regained enough strength to leave the hospital, the Lawsons were not only physically exhausted but emotionally battle-hardened. Every step toward their home was heavy with anxiety, every glance at the familiar street tinged with suspicion. The sight that awaited them was more than shocking. It was a betrayal of trust, a dismantling of a life they had built piece by piece. Yet, within that betrayal lay the spark of resolve, the understanding that if they were to reclaim what was theirs, they would have to confront not just the HOA, but the very system that enabled such injustice. The battle ahead was uncertain, intimidating, and emotionally exhausting. But it had begun, and so the stage was set. The family who had once simply lived in a peaceful suburban neighborhood now stood on the threshold of a fight that would test their limits, expose the ruthlessness of bureaucracy, and reveal the dark side of a community built on appearances rather than compassion. This was the beginning of their journey, a journey that would demand courage, tenacity, and an unyielding commitment to justice. When Laura finally left the hospital, the first thing she wanted was to take Mark home. To see him walk through the familiar doorway he had opened for decades. To sit on their couch, in the living room where the light spilled through the curtains every morning, and finally feel a sense of normalcy. But as she turned the corner onto Maple Ridge Boulevard, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Something was off. The mailbox, which had once been decorated with the little flags Evan loved to raise for Mail Day, now stood bare. A stranger's car was parked in the driveway, and on the front door, taped firmly as if to assert dominance, was a notice. Property of Maple Ridge Estates, HOA. Laura's heart stopped. She stared at the words, convinced her eyes were deceiving her. Evan jumped out of the car behind her, phone in hand, ready to document whatever had happened. "Mom, what is that?" he asked, voice trembling. His words barely carried over the roar in her ears. The disbelief, the fear, the rising panic. The door wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. Every familiar detail of their home, the doormat, the porch swing, the potted plants that Laura had nurtured for years, was gone. Their home, the place of birthdays, holidays, late-night homework sessions, quiet Sunday mornings, had been stripped from them while they were powerless to stop it. Inside the house, the air was foreign. Boxes lined the walls. Furniture that had belonged to the family was nowhere to be seen. It was as if someone had erased the Lawsons' life and replaced it with the hollow semblance of someone else's claim. The smell was different. The light fell differently. And yet every corner reminded Laura and Evan of what had been taken. The first call Laura made was to the HOA. Gerald Fox answered, as smug and composed as ever. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, voice crisp. "Your property has been sold in accordance with community bylaws. The auction has been completed. Please direct any questions to the legal department." "Sold?" Laura screamed, trying to keep her composure, trying to hold back the rising sobs. "My husband has been in a coma. You took our home while he was fighting for his life." "Rules are rules," Gerald said, and then he hung up. The line went dead. The sound was deafening. Laura sank to the curb, Evan beside her, both trembling. Their world had been stolen, not by a fire, not by a thief in the night, not by a natural disaster, but by paperwork, signatures, and an institution that saw them as nothing more than another case to close. For hours, Laura tried to make sense of it. She called the hospital repeatedly, retraced every document she had received, and tried to find any legal loophole or notification that might have been overlooked. She needed answers, but the answers were buried in bureaucratic language, in the fine print of community bylaws, in legalese that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. It became clear quickly that the HOA had exploited every loophole, every ambiguity, and every lack of oversight. Notices had been sent, technically, but never received. Deadlines had been enforced, but no opportunity for extension had been offered. Every step had been executed with precision, but with ruthless indifference to the human suffering it caused. Evan, young and angry, began documenting everything. He photographed the notice on the door, recorded every phone call, and started compiling a timeline of events. He was determined that if the world had taken their home without their knowledge, the world would at least know their story. Laura, exhausted but fueled by rage, started contacting attorneys. She had spent months by her husband's side in a hospital room, fighting for his life. Now she would fight for their home. The first attorney she spoke to was blunt. "The HOA followed the letter of their bylaws, Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Technically, they might have acted within their authority. But there are questions about notification, about due process, about whether your rights as homeowners were violated. This could be challenged, but it will be a long, uphill battle." Laura's resolve hardened. She would not let bureaucrats and self-important board members erase her family's life. Every photograph, every hospital record, every unopened envelope became evidence in the fight to reclaim what was theirs. She learned quickly that in the world of HOA law, small mistakes could have enormous consequences. $1,200 in fees could be weaponized. And the more she dug, the more she realized just how meticulously the HOA had planned to avoid accountability. Meanwhile, Mark was recovering slowly. His first days at home were filled with physical therapy, medical appointments, and constant care. But even as his body healed, his mind wrestled with the shock of what had happened. The realization that the home he had fought to build, to maintain, to love, had been taken from him while he lay helpless, left him stunned, angry, and deeply hurt. He trusted rules, he trusted his neighbors, he trusted the system. That trust had been shattered. The Lawsons began to piece together a timeline. The first notice from the HOA had arrived within weeks of Mark's stroke. Fines had accumulated steadily. The board had met in secrecy, voted on the foreclosure, and filed the lien without informing the family. And then the auction had been scheduled and completed, all without the family's knowledge. They were legally blindsided. They were victims of a system that valued rules over people, power over compassion. Laura contacted neighbors, hoping for support, hoping someone had seen something, hoping someone could explain how a home could be taken under such circumstances. But Maple Ridge was quiet. The neighbors were polite, cautious. No one wanted to get involved. Gerald Fox had built an aura of authority and fear. The HOA's actions were unchallenged because the community had been trained to obey, not question. As the family began to strategize, they realized the enormity of the challenge. They needed proof that the HOA had failed to follow state notification laws. They needed documentation of procedural errors. They needed witnesses, records, and legal expertise. And they needed time, something in short supply when every day without action allowed the auction buyers to consolidate their claim. Evan, still a teenager, took on the role of investigator. He tracked the sequence of letters, cross-referenced dates, and mapped out every fine, every board meeting, every procedural step the HOA had taken. It became clear that the HOA had relied on technicalities and assumptions, that the family would miss notices, that they would be too focused on the hospital to notice, that no one would challenge the process. And they had been correct, at least until now. Laura and Mark met with their attorney again, and this time the conversation was more strategic. "We can challenge this," the attorney said, "but it will require proving that the HOA did not follow state notification laws. We will need all letters, all receipts, and any evidence showing the family did not receive proper notice. It's not just about the money. It's about the process being followed incorrectly." Mark's anger grew, but so did his determination. "We're not just fighting for our home," he said. "We're fighting for fairness. We're fighting so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Laura nodded, exhausted but resolute. Evan's notebook of evidence lay on the table, the first of many steps toward justice. The HOA, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the family's resolve. Gerald Fox continued his patrols, checking lawns, enforcing bylaws, and assuming the Lawsons' defeat was final. But the wheels of resistance had been set in motion. One family, armed with determination, evidence, and the support of an attorney willing to challenge the rules, had begun to push back against the injustice. Late at night, Laura sat by Mark's side, holding his hand, recounting the memories of their home. "We'll get it back," she whispered. "We have to." Evan, in the next room, typed up notes, plotted timelines, and sent emails to the attorney. Every action was deliberate, methodical, and fueled by outrage at what had been done while Mark lay in a coma. The community, once a symbol of perfection and control, was about to witness the first cracks in its carefully maintained facade. The Lawsons' fight was no longer private. It would grow, exposing the methods, the arrogance, and the cold calculations of the HOA. And as the legal process began to unfold, the stakes became clear. They were not just fighting to reclaim a home. They were fighting to prove that, even in a system stacked against you, courage, determination, and truth could still make a difference. Every day brought new challenges. The auction buyers were unyielding. The HOA's legal team was aggressive. But the Lawsons' commitment did not waver. They documented every interaction, challenged every irregularity, and prepared for the long fight ahead. Each letter, each phone call, each consultation was a step toward justice. Mark slowly regained strength, walking through the halls of the hospital, then around the block, then finally to the driveway of what had once been their home. His eyes, once clouded with confusion and fear, now burned with determination. He understood more than ever the fragility of security, the danger of unchecked authority, and the power of persistence. Laura, Evan, and Mark stood together in the driveway, facing the house that had been taken from them. The sight of strangers' belongings, the changed locks, and the official notices was devastating. But it also ignited a spark, a fire that would drive them through months of legal battles, community scrutiny, and emotional turmoil. The fight had begun and they were ready. The first chapter of their struggle had ended in loss and shock. The second chapter, the real battle for their home and justice, was just beginning. And while the HOA assumed they had won, they had no idea that the Lawsons were about to turn the tables, exposing the mistakes, greed, and ruthlessness that had led to this unimaginable theft. This was more than a fight for a house. It was a fight for dignity, for family, and for the principle that no system, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to strip someone of their life's work while they were helpless to defend it. The Lawsons' journey had only just begun, and the community that had once seemed untouchable was about to be tested in ways it had never imagined. The morning after the discovery of their stolen home, Laura sat at the kitchen table of a friend's house, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her mind refused to rest. Every detail of the previous day replayed in her head: the taped notice on the door, the changed locks, the unfamiliar furniture, the cold voice of Gerald Fox over the phone. $1,200 in landscaping fees had stolen $400,000 of her family's life. It seemed impossible. And yet, the paperwork, the auction records, and the unflinching indifference of the HOA proved it had happened. Mark, though recovering physically, was still weak. His hands shook slightly as he held his coffee, and his eyes betrayed the mix of shock, anger, and disbelief that neither sleep nor time could soothe. Evan, ever the observer, sat across from his mother, his laptop open, fingers poised, his teenage face etched with frustration and determination. "Mom," he said softly, "we need to get organized. We need a timeline, every letter, every fine, every notice. We need to show exactly how this happened." Laura nodded, exhausted but resolute. She began sifting through the remaining paperwork, carefully documenting dates, receipts, and letters. Every envelope the HOA had sent became critical evidence. Every detail of the auction process was scrutinized. As they worked, a horrifying picture emerged. The HOA had followed a process that was technically legal according to their internal bylaws, but every step violated the intent of the law, and more importantly, the spirit of fairness. The first discovery that shook them to their core was the timeline of notices. The initial violation for the overgrown lawn had been mailed just days after Mark's stroke. It was addressed to the home, where no one could receive it because Laura had been at the hospital and Evan was at school. Subsequent notices piled up, each one adding another fine, each one legally sufficient in appearance, but fundamentally flawed in execution. The HOA had used the family's incapacitation as an opportunity, assuming no one would contest the escalating fees. "What kind of system lets something like this happen?" Laura whispered, her voice shaking. "They knew he was in the hospital. They could have waited. They could have shown a little humanity. But instead, they took everything." Mark's gaze hardened. "It's not just humanity they lack. It's accountability. They think they're untouchable because the rules are on their side. But rules aren't supposed to steal people's lives." The first step in their fight was to confront the HOA formally. Laura called Gerald Fox again, demanding to speak with someone who could explain the auction. The call was brief and infuriating. Gerald repeated the mantra, "Rules are rules. The auction was conducted according to our bylaws. You should have monitored your property." He refused to acknowledge the circumstances, the stroke, the coma, the family's inability to respond. Every word was cold, calculated, and dismissive. Laura hung up, shaking with rage, the phone slipping from her hands. Evan, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "We need proof that they didn't follow state notification laws. That's our angle. If they skipped proper legal steps, we have a real chance." The family hired an attorney, a woman named Rebecca Marlowe, who specialized in HOA disputes and property law. Rebecca quickly explained the gravity of the situation. They followed the HOA's internal rules, but there are state laws that govern notice and due process, she said, spreading legal documents across the table. If we can prove that notices were not properly delivered, that deadlines were enforced without ensuring actual communication, we can challenge the sale. The law exists to protect homeowners, and in this case it appears those protections were ignored. Laura felt a flicker of hope, tempered by the exhaustion of the previous months. Mark listened, silent but attentive, absorbing every word. Evan leaned closer, scanning the documents with a keen eye. For the first time since discovering the theft, the family had a strategy. They weren't powerless anymore. They were prepared to fight. The next step involved gathering evidence. They needed proof of delivery, postal records, and copies of every letter the HOA claimed to have sent. Laura spent hours on the phone with the post office, tracing registered mail, tracking receipts, and piecing together a picture of what had actually reached the family. Evan organized the documents in digital folders, meticulously cataloging each interaction. Mark, though still weak, contributed by recalling conversations, timelines, and his observations before and after the stroke. As they worked, another harsh reality set in. The auction buyer, the person who had purchased their home for $15,000, was now in possession of the property. Attempts to contact them yielded little. The buyer claimed to have purchased the home legally and refused to negotiate. The Lawsons realized that reclaiming their home would not just be a matter of challenging the HOA but potentially confronting a third party who had acquired the property in good faith, unaware of the injustice that had taken place. The community itself remained an obstacle. Neighbors who had once waved cheerfully were now wary, hesitant to speak. Maple Ridge Estates, with its immaculate lawns and quiet streets, appeared unshaken by the turmoil within the Lawson household. Gerald Fox continued his patrols, enforcing bylaws on other properties, confident that the Lawsons were finished. He did not anticipate the tenacity of a family pushed to the brink, nor the legal scrutiny that was about to expose the cracks in the system he relied on. Laura and Rebecca began drafting formal complaints. They cited violations of state notice laws, procedural errors, and the unfairness of the auction conducted while the homeowner was incapacitated. Every document was filed carefully, with deadlines tracked and cross-referenced. Each submission felt like a step toward justice, a way to claw back control over a life that had been stolen. At the same time, Mark's recovery continued. Physical therapy sessions were grueling, but they were also a reminder of his resilience. Each step he took was a victory, each small improvement a testament to the determination that would fuel their fight for their home. He often sat with Evan, reviewing the evidence together, asking questions, strategizing next steps. The family's unity strengthened under pressure, their focus sharpened by the injustice they had endured. Despite their preparation, the emotional toll was immense. Laura found herself crying late at night. Alone in the hospital room they had temporarily converted into a makeshift office. The memories of the home, the laughter, the celebrations, the quiet evenings, haunted her. She clung to the belief that justice was possible, but the weight of months spent in fear, anger, and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm her. Evan, though younger, displayed remarkable resilience. His determination to help his family drove him to learn, research, and fight in ways that mirrored the adults around him. In the following weeks, the HOA began to respond, albeit reluctantly. Gerald Fox sent letters claiming compliance with all rules and bylaws, insisting that the auction was final and that the family had no recourse. Laura and Rebecca countered with detailed documentation, showing that state-mandated notices had not been properly served, that deadlines had been enforced without due consideration of the homeowner's incapacitation, and that the process was fundamentally flawed. Each exchange escalated the tension, highlighting the stark contrast between bureaucratic procedure and human consequences. The media became another avenue for raising awareness. Laura contacted local reporters, sharing the story of how a family had lost their home over minor fees while dealing with a medical crisis. Journalists were initially skeptical, A HOA dispute seemed mundane, until they reviewed the evidence, the timeline, and the glaring inequities. Articles were written, and the community began to take notice. The story resonated because it was not just about property. It was about human suffering, the abuse of power, and the fragility of security in a system that prioritized rules over people. As public attention grew, Gerald Fox and the HOA began to feel pressure. Board members whispered in hallways, legal counsel advised caution, and the once unquestioned authority of the HOA began to crack. The Lawsons, meanwhile, found that their fight had given them strength. They discovered allies in the community, a few neighbors who were outraged by the treatment of the family, attorneys who specialized in HOA law, and activists who had faced similar struggles. The momentum shifted, slowly but unmistakably, from despair to resistance. Mark, now stronger physically, began attending strategy meetings with Laura and Rebecca. His voice, once weak and hesitant, grew confident as he spoke about the principles at stake: fairness, justice, and the right of a family to protect their home. Evan's meticulous records became central to their case, documenting every misstep, every error, and every violation of state law. Together, the family formed a coordinated front, combining emotional resilience with legal precision. Despite the progress, challenges remained. The auction buyer, although legally in possession, had invested little and had no attachment to the home. Negotiations were tense, requiring patience and strategy. The HOA, confident in its internal procedures, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Every day brought new obstacles: additional legal filings, procedural delays, and the constant emotional strain of confronting the reality of their stolen life. Yet, even in the midst of this struggle, hope persisted. Each small victory, a court acknowledgement of procedural errors, a supportive neighbor, a favorable media mention, reinforced the belief that justice was possible. The Lawson story became not just a personal fight, but a symbol of resistance against unchecked power, a reminder that determination, evidence, and persistence could challenge even the most entrenched systems. By the end of this chapter of their journey, the Lawsons were no longer merely victims. They were advocates, investigators, and strategists. The theft of their home had revealed vulnerabilities in the system, but it had also awakened a fierce determination to reclaim what was theirs. The fight ahead would be long, emotionally taxing, and fraught with obstacles, but they were ready. They had discovered their strength, their unity, and their capacity to confront injustice head-on. The first step had been survival. The second step was preparation. And the third step, the one that would bring their story to the forefront and challenge the authority of the HOA, was about to begin. The Lawsons were armed not just with evidence and legal support, but with the unbreakable resolve of a family that had already endured more than most could imagine. The morning light filtered through the blinds of a small law office where Laura, Mark, and Evan sat with Rebecca Marlowe, their attorney. A stack of documents, legal briefs, and official notices covered the conference table. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, but to the Lawsons, it was the arena where the battle for their home would be fought. For the first time since the stroke, the family felt a sense of purpose beyond recovery, a sense of agency in the face of injustice. Rebecca tapped her pen against a pile of evidence. "We have a strong case," she said. The HOA failed to follow state notification laws. They filed the auction while Mark was incapacitated, which could be considered a violation of his rights as a homeowner. And there are discrepancies in how the notices were delivered and documented. Laura leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly but her voice firm. "We need them held accountable. This wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. They saw an opportunity while Mark was in the hospital and took it. They treated our lives like a checklist." Mark's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter that they followed their internal rules. The system exists to protect homeowners, not to exploit them when they're vulnerable. We need to make sure everyone sees that. Evan, scanning the documents, nodded. "I've cross-referenced every letter, every fine, every date. There's no way they can argue we were notified properly. They didn't follow state law, and we have the proof." With the strategy laid out, the family prepared to file a formal challenge to the auction. They would argue that the sale was invalid due to procedural errors, that the HOA had acted in bad faith, and that Mark's rights had been violated during a time when he was unable to respond. Every detail was critical, and Rebecca made sure no stone was left unturned. Meanwhile, the HOA remained confident. Gerald Fox and his board continued their daily routines, patrolling the neighborhood, enforcing bylaws, and ignoring the storm brewing on the horizon. They assumed the Lawsons had no resources, no leverage, and no plan to fight back. But the Lawsons had discovered something powerful, that knowledge, determination, and documentation could challenge even the most entrenched authority. The first hearing was scheduled in a small, gray courtroom, the kind where the air smells faintly of old wood and forgotten arguments. Laura and Mark sat side by side, Evan at their feet with a notebook, each page filled with meticulously recorded details. Rebecca presented the case with precision, highlighting the failures in notification, the timing of the auction, and the disregard for Mark's incapacitation. She pointed out that while the HOA might claim adherence to internal bylaws, state law required proper notice, due process, and consideration of extenuating circumstances. Gerald Fox sat at the HOA table, expression unreadable, occasionally whispering to his attorney. The tension in the room was palpable. Neighbors had started to attend the hearing, curious about the family whose life had been upended by something as seemingly mundane as landscaping fees. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered in outrage. The quiet, controlled facade of Maple Ridge Estates was beginning to crack. The judge listened carefully, reviewing the documents, examining the timeline, and asking pointed questions. Were the notices verified as received by the homeowners? She asked. Gerald's attorney nodded quickly, asserting that the HOA had followed procedure. Rebecca countered, presenting postal receipts, affidavits, and detailed notes showing that the letters never reached the family, or were addressed to the home while the homeowner was incapacitated. The argument was meticulous, evidence-driven, and impossible to ignore. Outside the courtroom, reporters had begun to gather. The story of a family losing their home while a husband fought for his life resonated far beyond Maple Ridge. Cameras captured Laura and Mark's faces, weary yet determined, as they walked through the courthouse doors. The community, once silent, was now paying attention. Social media posts began circulating, spreading outrage and demanding accountability from the HOA. Back inside the courtroom, tensions escalated. Gerald Fox's calm veneer began to crack as Rebecca exposed inconsistencies in the HOA's documentation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The HOA did not provide proper notice as required by state law. They proceeded with an auction while the homeowner was incapacitated, knowing he could not respond. This action constitutes a violation of his rights and an abuse of authority." Mark's hands clenched tightly, his knuckles white. He felt a mix of anger, fear, and vindication. Every minute in that courtroom was a step toward reclaiming his life, his home, and his dignity. Laura's eyes were fixed on the judge, silently pleading for justice, while Evan quietly typed notes on his laptop, documenting every exchange for future reference. The judge called for a brief recess, and the room buzzed with tension. Laura and Mark stepped into the hallway, breathing deeply. "We're doing it," Laura whispered. "We're actually doing it." Mark nodded, exhaustion and determination etched on his face. "We have to. We can't let them get away with this." During the recess, Gerald Fox conferred with his attorney, frustration evident in his furrowed brow. The meticulous preparation of the Lawsons had caught them off guard. They had assumed compliance with bylaws would be enough to secure the auction, but Rebecca's thorough documentation challenged the very foundation of their actions. Whispers of concern passed between board members. For the first time, they realized the fight might not be so easily won. When the hearing resumed, Rebecca presented additional evidence, including witness statements from neighbors who had observed the family's struggles, hospital records confirming Mark's incapacitation, and detailed timelines showing the HOA's deliberate scheduling of fines and auction notices. The courtroom listened in silence, the weight of injustice settling heavily in the air. Mark spoke for the first time during the proceedings. His voice was steady, measured, but filled with emotion. "I was fighting for my life," he said, "and while I lay in a hospital bed, my home, the place my family and I built with our hands and our hearts, was taken from us. This is not about landscaping fees. This is about accountability, fairness, and the abuse of power. We ask that the court recognize the violations and return our home to us." The judge nodded, taking notes carefully. The room remained tense as she considered the arguments. Gerald Fox shifted uncomfortably, his confidence waning under the scrutiny. The power dynamic had shifted. What had seemed like an untouchable HOA was now exposed to public, legal, and moral examination. After hours of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, the judge recessed for deliberation. Laura and Mark stepped outside, greeted by a small group of neighbors who had attended the hearing. Words of encouragement, pats on the shoulder, and expressions of sympathy filled the air. For the first time since the home had been stolen, the Lawsons felt a glimmer of hope. They had taken the first real step toward justice. As the family returned home, not to their house, but to the temporary residence they had rented during the legal battle, they reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The HOA had underestimated them. Gerald Fox had assumed compliance and silence would ensure victory. But the Lawsons had proven that resilience, preparation, and determination could challenge even the most entrenched authority. Evan remained quiet for a moment, staring at his laptop. "We're not done yet," he said, breaking the silence. "They think they can intimidate us, but every mistake they've made is evidence. Every violation is another step toward winning this." Laura nodded, exhaustion and resolve mingling in her expression. "We have to see this through. For Mark, for Evan, for our family. They can't take our home and get away with it." Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. "We'll get it back," he said. "It's not just a house. It's our life. And we're not giving up." Back at the HOA headquarters, Gerald Fox and the board convened another meeting. The tension was palpable. For the first time, the board recognized that the Lawsons were not going to accept defeat quietly. The meticulous preparation, legal strategy, and public attention had thrown their assumptions into chaos. Whispers of internal conflict, fear of legal repercussions, and concern for reputation filled the room. The once commanding presence of the HOA president was faltering. The Lawsons, meanwhile, continued their work, reviewing legal strategies, gathering additional evidence, and preparing for the next stages of the battle. Each document, each recorded conversation, and each witness statement became a tool in their arsenal. The fight was far from over, but the trajectory was clear. The family was no longer powerless. They had uncovered the weaknesses in the system and were prepared to exploit them to reclaim their home. As night fell over Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood appeared calm, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The stolen home, the indifferent HOA, and the community's quiet complicity had set the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of law, ethics, and human determination. The Lawsons had begun to turn the tide, and the next steps would bring the HOA's actions into sharper focus, exposing greed, arrogance, and the human cost of unchecked authority. In this chapter of their journey, the Lawsons had transformed from shocked victims into active challengers. The legal battle had begun, evidence was mounting, and public attention was growing. The fight for justice was no longer a distant hope, it was underway. And as they prepared for the next hearings, the family knew one thing with certainty. They would not rest until their home, their memories, and their rights were restored. The battle lines were drawn, the stakes were higher than ever, and the world was beginning to pay attention. Maple Ridge Estates, with all its manicured lawns and quiet streets, would never again be a place where injustice could hide in plain sight. The weeks following the first hearing brought a tense mixture of hope and frustration. The Lawsons' lives had been upended, but the fire inside them had only grown stronger. Each morning, Laura awoke with a determination that outshone her exhaustion, knowing that the fight for their home would not wait. Mark, recovering steadily from the stroke, focused not just on rebuilding his health but on reclaiming the life that had been stolen from them. Evan, meticulous and driven, tracked every detail of the ongoing legal battle. His teenage resolve transformed into the force of a young investigator dedicated to justice. Yet, outside the temporary safety of their rented home, the HOA was mobilizing. Gerald Fox and his board, realizing that the Lawsons had the potential to challenge the auction's legality, began digging for ways to intimidate, delay, or undermine the family. Emails were sent late at night, cryptic legal notices arrived with little explanation, and anonymous calls to neighbors implied that the Lawsons were troublemakers, stirring unnecessary drama. The HOA's strategy was clear: make the family feel isolated, powerless, and overwhelmed. But Laura, Mark, and Evan refused to be intimidated. They held a family meeting at the small living room of their temporary home, papers and laptops strewn across every surface. "They're trying to scare us," Laura said, her voice calm but resolute. "We can't let them. We have evidence. We have the law on our side. And we have each other." Mark, his hand resting on his cane, nodded. "Every action they take to intimidate us just proves how guilty they are. We're exposing them one document at a time. We're not just fighting for our home, we're fighting for fairness, for principle, and for anyone else who might be next." Evan, reviewing a folder of legal documents, chimed in. "I've compiled every notice, every timeline, every interaction. The HOA's internal memos show they were aware Mark was incapacitated. They targeted him because they thought we wouldn't respond. But now we're responding, and we're ready." The Lawsons' attorney, Rebecca Marlowe, advised patience but emphasized the importance of public awareness. "This case isn't just about property," she said. "It's about exposing a system that can take advantage of people in vulnerable situations. We have a strong legal argument, but media coverage and public support will add pressure. It will make it harder for the HOA to continue their tactics unchecked." With Rebecca's guidance, the family reached out to local reporters, sharing their story in painstaking detail. Hospital records confirmed Mark's incapacitation, timelines showed the accumulation of fines, and documents exposed the auction process. Photographs of their home before and after the auction, along with letters ignored by the HOA, painted a clear picture of the injustice. The media response was immediate. Articles were published, interviews aired, and social media amplified the story. "Family loses home while father fights for life," one headline screamed. "HOA auction sparks outrage in Maple Ridge Estates," read another. The public was shocked. $1,200 had stolen a $400,000 home, and it had been done under the guise of bureaucratic legality. Comments flooded in from readers and viewers expressing outrage, empathy, and support. Gerald Fox, reading about the coverage, felt the first real cracks in his authority. Board members whispered concerns, worried about reputational damage and legal exposure. The HOA had counted on the Lawsons' silence, their grief, and the opacity of their process. But the spotlight had shifted. Suddenly, the organization that had wielded power without accountability found itself on the defensive. In the courtroom, the second hearing brought additional revelations. Rebecca presented previously undisclosed internal communications from the HOA, showing that board members had discussed the Lawsons' incapacitation as an advantage. Emails and meeting minutes revealed a disturbing pattern of premeditation. The HOA had not merely enforced rules. It had exploited the family's vulnerability. The judge, reviewing the documents, raised her eyebrows. "This is concerning," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The court expects fair treatment and adherence to state laws, especially in cases where the homeowner is incapacitated. I will consider these factors carefully." Mark, sitting beside Laura, felt a mix of vindication and renewed anger. "We've proven what we suspected," he whispered. "They took advantage of me when I was helpless. And now the world is seeing it too." Outside the courtroom, the media coverage continued to build. Local news crews interviewed Laura, who spoke candidly about the emotional toll, the betrayal, and the importance of accountability. Evan, quiet but articulate, described the meticulous research he had undertaken to expose the HOA's missteps. Mark, once hesitant to relive the trauma, spoke about resilience, recovery, and the fight to reclaim what was theirs. Public pressure began to mount. Neighbors who had once remained silent now reached out, expressing concern, offering support, and in some cases, questioning their own compliance with the HOA's strict rules. The community's veneer of perfection was cracking, revealing the human cost of unchecked authority. Meanwhile, the HOA attempted damage control. Gerald Fox released a public statement claiming adherence to bylaws, insisting that all actions were legal and fair. But the statement rang hollow in light of the evidence, the testimony, and the media coverage. Social media posts circulated screenshots of the internal communications, highlighting the deliberate targeting of the Lawsons. Public sentiment had shifted decisively in favor of the family. Back at their temporary home, the Lawsons continued to prepare. Each legal filing, each witness statement, and each piece of evidence was cataloged meticulously. They anticipated counterarguments, prepared for delays, and strategized for every possible scenario. The family had transformed from victims into advocates, investigators, and fighters, united by the injustice they had endured and the determination to reclaim their home. As the weeks passed, the emotional toll remained significant. Sleep was scarce, stress levels high, and the pressure relentless. Yet, the Lawsons found strength in each other. Laura and Mark shared quiet moments reflecting on what had been lost and what could be regained. Evan found solace in his research and documentation, channeling frustration into productive action. Together, they navigated the complex legal landscape, supported by Rebecca's guidance and the growing support of their community. In one particularly tense court session, the judge questioned the HOA's process in detail. Were proper procedures followed? She asked. Was the homeowner given fair opportunity to respond? Gerald Fox, visibly uncomfortable, struggled to provide satisfactory answers. Rebecca presented her meticulously organized evidence, highlighting gaps, omissions, and procedural errors. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelations settling over everyone present. The atmosphere in Maple Ridge Estates began to shift. Community members who had once accepted the HOA's authority without question now whispered about accountability, fairness, and the potential for reform. The Lawson story had become a catalyst, revealing vulnerabilities in a system that had long operated without scrutiny. One evening, Laura sat with Mark and Evan in their temporary living room, reviewing the latest filings. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "But the fight isn't over. They'll try to push back, to delay, to intimidate. We have to stay focused." Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "Every obstacle they throw at us is proof of how important this fight is. We're not just reclaiming a house, we're standing up to injustice. And we won't back down." Evan, typing furiously on his laptop, added, "We've already exposed so much. Every misstep they've made is documented. They can't hide it anymore." The stage was set for the next phase of the battle. The HOA, shaken but stubborn, would escalate their tactics, attempting to assert authority and maintain control. But the Lawsons, armed with evidence, public support, and an unyielding determination, were prepared for whatever came next. The fight was no longer just legal, it was personal, moral, and public. As night fell over Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood appeared serene, the lawns perfect, the streets quiet. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The stolen home, the relentless HOA, and the mounting legal battle had exposed the fault lines in the community's carefully maintained facade. The Lawsons' resilience and determination had turned the tide, but the most critical confrontations were still ahead. This chapter of their journey ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The Lawsons were no longer passive victims. They were active challengers, prepared to confront the full weight of the HOA's authority. The story was now larger than a single family. It was about accountability, fairness, and the courage to fight when the odds seem insurmountable. And as the family prepared for the next hearings, the next legal filings, and the continued scrutiny of the HOA, one thing was certain. They would not rest until justice had been served, until their home was restored, and until the community that allowed such injustice to occur had been forced to reckon with the human cost of unchecked power. The following weeks marked a turning point in the Lawsons' fight. What had begun as a personal struggle to reclaim their stolen home was evolving into a full-scale exposure of systemic corruption within Maple Ridge Estates HOA. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for legal arguments. It had become a stage on which the truth would be unveiled, and the facade of authority would crack under scrutiny. Rebecca Marlowe had spent countless hours reviewing internal HOA communications, financial records, and procedural documents. She discovered a pattern that went far beyond the Lawsons case. The HOA had a history of targeting incapacitated or vulnerable homeowners, exploiting technicalities to levy fines, liens, and foreclosures. They had used small debts, sometimes just a few $100s, as leverage to seize properties worth hundreds of thousands, selling them at auction for a fraction of their value. Laura, Mark, and Evan pored over the documents, their eyes widening in disbelief. "This isn't just about us," Laura said, her voice shaking with both anger and resolve. "They've done this to other families. They've used fear and paperwork as weapons." Mark's fists clenched. "We have to stop them, not just for our family, but for everyone else. They can't keep getting away with this." Evan, ever meticulous, began compiling evidence. He cross-referenced auction records, HOA fines, and complaints from other homeowners. The pattern was undeniable. Gerald Fox and the board had operated in a system that allowed them to act with near-total impunity. The Lawsons were now not only fighting to reclaim their home, but also exposing a network of abuses that had persisted for years. The next court session revealed the depth of the HOA's duplicity. Rebecca presented emails and memos from the board, showing discussions about targeting homeowners while they were incapacitated or otherwise distracted. One email, dated months before the Lawsons auction, read, "If we wait until they're unable to respond, the fines and lien process will guarantee the property is ours. Timing is critical." The courtroom gasped when Rebecca read it aloud. The calculated exploitation of vulnerable people was undeniable. Laura felt her stomach twist with anger. "They planned this while my husband was fighting for his life," she whispered. Mark squeezed her hand, silent but seething. Evan's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a determination that mirrored his father's. The judge paused, reviewing the documents. "This is extremely troubling," she said. "The court takes allegations of bad faith very seriously. We will need to examine the evidence carefully, but these communications could have significant implications." Outside the courtroom, media coverage intensified. Local news crews interviewed neighbors, some of whom admitted they had known about questionable practices but had been too intimidated to speak. Social media posts chronicling the Lawson story went viral, drawing attention from advocacy groups and legal watchdogs. The story was no longer about a single family. It had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked HOA power. Back home, the Lawsons continued to prepare. Every day, they reviewed documents, drafted affidavits, and consulted with Rebecca. The emotional toll was heavy, but the momentum of public attention and legal validation gave them strength. They were no longer isolated. They had allies, witnesses, and evidence that could not be ignored. Mark, now stronger physically, spent hours with Evan, going over financial records, HOA minutes, and auction details. "We need to understand every step they took," he said. "Every violation, every misstep, every unethical decision. We'll use it all." Evan nodded, absorbing the information. "I found at least 3 other homeowners who were similarly targeted," he said. "They didn't fight back, but if we include their cases, we can show this was intentional, not accidental." Laura focused on witness coordination. She contacted other families affected by the HOA's tactics, helping them prepare affidavits and statements for court. The network of victims began to form a small coalition, amplifying the Lawsons case and demonstrating that this was a systemic problem, not an isolated incident. During the next hearing, Rebecca presented a damning compilation of evidence. Internal communications revealed not only premeditated targeting of incapacitated homeowners, but also efforts to conceal missteps, misfile notices, and manipulate auction results. The judge examined each document, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. Gerald Fox appeared increasingly tense, shuffling papers and muttering to his attorney. Mark watched as the truth unfolded. "They thought we were weak," he said quietly. "They thought we'd accept it. But now everyone can see who they really are." Laura's eyes welled with tears, a mixture of relief and vindication. "We're doing it," she whispered. "We're exposing them." The HOA's defense team attempted to downplay the significance of the communications, insisting that internal discussions were merely procedural and that the auction had been legally valid. Rebecca countered methodically, connecting every email, memo, and meeting note to specific violations of state notification laws and homeowner rights. She emphasized the human cost, the trauma inflicted while Mark was in a coma, the family's displacement, and the broader pattern of targeting vulnerable residents. The courtroom was tense. Witnesses from other affected families testified, sharing their experiences of intimidation, sudden fines, and coerced auctions. Their stories mirrored the Lawsons, reinforcing the argument that the HOA's actions were systematic rather than accidental. The collective testimony painted a picture of an organization that prioritized power, profit, and control over fairness and community well-being. Outside the courtroom, the media coverage reached a national audience. Headlines described the HOA as predatory and ruthless, highlighting the tiny fees used to justify the seizure of valuable homes. Advocacy groups called for investigations into HOA practices statewide, citing the Lawsons case as emblematic of a broader problem. Back in their temporary home, the Lawsons reflected on how far they had come. Months earlier, they had been powerless, blindsided by the auction and the indifferent HOA. Now, they were actively shaping the narrative, armed with evidence, public support, and a legal team prepared to challenge every facet of the HOA's conduct. Mark spoke during one late-night planning session. "We've turned the tables," he said. "They thought they could exploit us while I was helpless. But we're not just fighting for our home. We're fighting to make sure this can't happen to anyone else." Evan looked up from his laptop. "We've got the proof. We've got the stories. And now the public is watching. Every action they take will be scrutinized." Laura nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "We've already won in the court of truth. Now it's just a matter of law." The next hearings focused on the legality of the auction and the potential restitution to the Lawsons. Rebecca meticulously detailed every procedural flaw. Improper notice, lack of confirmation of delivery, failure to consider Mark's incapacitation, and internal communications demonstrating bad faith. Each argument chipped away at the HOA's defenses, exposing their arrogance and the systematic exploitation of residents. The HOA's position weakened further when witnesses corroborated the timeline of fines, notices, and auction actions. Their claims of procedural compliance were contradicted by evidence, leaving Gerald Fox and the board increasingly isolated. The judge, visibly concerned, requested additional documentation and suggested that the court was taking the Lawsons' claims seriously. As the hearings continued, the Lawsons began to see the possibility of reclaiming their home. The legal battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Public attention, documented evidence, and witness testimony had created pressure the HOA could not ignore. The once confident board members were now defensive, their authority eroding with every revelation. One evening, after another long day in court, Laura, Mark, and Evan sat together, reflecting on the journey. "We've uncovered so much," Laura said. "They thought we'd be crushed, but we're exposing them." Mark smiled faintly, exhaustion lining his face. "It's not just about the home anymore. It's about justice, accountability, and ensuring that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else." Evan, typing up the day's notes, added, "The more we expose, the stronger our case becomes. This isn't just a fight, it's a movement." The stage was set for the final phases of the legal battle. The HOA's corruption had been revealed, their authority challenged, and their reputation damaged. The Lawsons, though weary from months of struggle, were empowered by the knowledge that they were on the right side of justice. As night fell over Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood appeared unchanged. Lawns were trimmed, fences stood tall, and quiet streets remained. But beneath the surface, a reckoning was underway. The stolen home, the HOA's manipulation, and the months of struggle had exposed vulnerabilities in a system that had long operated without scrutiny. The Lawsons' determination, evidence, and courage had turned what seemed like an insurmountable fight into a powerful challenge against injustice. This chapter of their journey ended with hope, resolve, and the knowledge that the fight was far from over. The Lawsons had exposed the HOA's wrongdoing, rallied public support, and gained momentum in court. The final chapters would bring the resolution, restitution, and the ultimate vindication of a family wronged, but resilient, determined, and united in their pursuit of justice. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the Lawsons, Rebecca Marlowe, and their witnesses arrived for the next hearing. Months of preparation, investigation, and persistence had led to this moment. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence had been meticulously compiled to expose the HOA's bad faith, procedural errors, and calculated exploitation of the family's vulnerability. This was the turning point. Mark sat beside Laura, his hand occasionally gripping hers for support. The weight of the months they had endured, hospital stays, legal paperwork, public scrutiny, emotional exhaustion, pressed down, but there was also a quiet confidence. They were no longer helpless victims. They were advocates armed with the truth. Evan, sitting at their feet with a laptop open, kept careful notes of every exchange, his young eyes reflecting a maturity born from months of crisis. Rebecca addressed the court with precision. Your Honor, we have presented substantial evidence showing that the HOA violated state notification laws, acted in bad faith, and auctioned the property while Mr. Lawson was incapacitated. This was not an isolated error. It was a deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable homeowner. The judge leaned forward, reviewing the binder in front of her. She glanced at Gerald Fox, who sat stiffly with the HOA's legal team. The confidence he had exuded in prior hearings was noticeably absent. His eyes flickered across the room, scanning the faces of the Lawsons, the witnesses, and the judge. It was clear that the tide was turning. Witnesses from other affected families stepped forward. Their testimonies echoed the Lawsons' experiences. Sudden fines, obscure liens, and auctions conducted with little to no communication. Each story reinforced the pattern of abuse and calculated manipulation. The court listened intently as Rebecca connected each case to procedural missteps and violations of state law. Laura felt a mixture of relief and empowerment. Each testimony, each piece of evidence was a step closer to justice. Months of fear, anxiety, and helplessness had transformed into tangible progress. Mark's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. The judge paused before asking Gerald Fox a pointed question. Mr. Fox, were you aware of Mr. Lawson's medical condition at the time these actions were taken? Gerald shifted uncomfortably. The HOA followed its internal procedures, he replied, voice strained. All notices were issued according to bylaws. Rebecca immediately countered, presenting emails, memos, and meeting notes indicating that the board had discussed Mark's incapacitation as a tactical advantage. Your Honor, this demonstrates deliberate exploitation, not adherence to procedure, she said firmly. The HOA targeted a homeowner unable to respond and proceeded with an auction that resulted in the sale of a $400,000 property for only $15,000. The courtroom was silent. The magnitude of the wrongdoing was impossible to ignore. Even some of the HOA's own witnesses, called to testify about standard procedures, appeared uneasy as the evidence unfolded. It was becoming clear that the board's actions were not just legally questionable but morally indefensible. Outside the courtroom, news crews gathered, filming and interviewing community members. The Lawson story had reached a wider audience, igniting discussions about HOA power, homeowner rights, and accountability. Social media amplified the outrage, spreading the story far beyond Maple Ridge Estates. Advocates for homeowners' rights began citing the case as a landmark example of systemic abuse and the importance of transparency. Back in court, Rebecca shifted her focus to the auction itself. She presented a detailed timeline showing that the sale occurred while Mark was incapacitated, that the property was sold below market value, and that proper legal procedures were not followed. Comparative property assessments were submitted, highlighting the stark contrast between the auction price and the home's actual worth. The evidence was overwhelming. Mark felt a surge of emotion as the reality of their case sank in. "They took everything from us while I was fighting for my life," he said quietly to Laura. "Now everyone is seeing it. They can't deny it anymore." Laura squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes. "We're finally being heard," she replied. Evan, ever vigilant, noted the reactions of the courtroom observers. "Even their own legal team is struggling," he whispered. "You can see it in the way they avoid eye contact." The judge, after reviewing the evidence and listening to the arguments, issued a preliminary ruling. While a final decision would come later, she acknowledged the serious procedural violations and indicated that the auction could be overturned. The HOA's authority was being questioned, and the evidence of bad faith weighed heavily against them. Outside the courthouse, the Lawsons were greeted by a small crowd of supporters. Neighbors who had previously remained silent expressed admiration and encouragement. Local reporters sought interviews, eager to capture the family's reaction. The Lawsons, exhausted but resolute, shared their story, emphasizing the importance of holding powerful organizations accountable and protecting vulnerable homeowners. Gerald Fox and the HOA board returned to their offices, the atmosphere tense and uncertain. For the first time, they faced the real consequences of their actions. The meticulous evidence, public scrutiny, and legal challenges had shaken their confidence. The perception of invulnerability that had guided their decisions was crumbling. In the weeks that followed, the legal battle intensified. The court ordered additional disclosures from the HOA, compelling them to produce internal records, communications, and financial documents. Each document revealed further evidence of premeditation and unethical conduct. The board's attempts to downplay or obscure their actions were increasingly ineffective against the Lawsons' thorough preparation and the mounting public attention. During this period, the Lawsons also focused on community outreach. Laura organized meetings with other homeowners affected by the HOA's practices, encouraging them to come forward with statements and documentation. The coalition grew, strengthening the case and demonstrating the broader pattern of misconduct. Mark, despite the demands of recovery, attended these meetings, emphasizing the importance of unity and collective action. Evan coordinated the digital documentation, creating a comprehensive archive of evidence that was both detailed and accessible. As the momentum grew, the HOA attempted to negotiate behind the scenes, offering settlements that would not fully restore the family's home or reputation. Rebecca advised against compromise, emphasizing that public accountability and the return of the property were non-negotiable. The Lawsons remained steadfast, understanding that accepting less than full justice would undermine the principles for which they had fought. Court hearings continued, with each session exposing additional HOA missteps. Witnesses testified about intimidation, the misuse of fines, and the manipulation of internal records to justify foreclosures. The judge, taking careful notes, appeared increasingly critical of the HOA's conduct. Public awareness and media coverage ensured that every hearing carried weight beyond the courtroom, amplifying the impact of the case and applying pressure on the board. Finally, after months of hearings, evidence presentations, and public scrutiny, the judge issued a ruling in favor of the Lawsons. The auction was declared invalid, procedural violations were acknowledged, and the HOA was ordered to return the property to its rightful owners. Additionally, the court required the HOA to pay restitution for damages, legal fees, and the emotional toll inflicted on the family. Mark, Laura, and Evan embraced as the ruling was read. Tears streamed down Laura's face as she whispered, "We did it. We really did it." Mark held his family close, a mix of relief, vindication, and triumph washing over him. Evan, overwhelmed but proud, recorded the moment quietly, knowing this victory was the culmination of months of perseverance, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The HOA's authority in Maple Ridge Estates was shattered. Gerald Fox and the board faced both legal and public consequences, their credibility damaged, and their ability to intimidate residents permanently weakened. The Lawsons' fight had not only restored their home but also exposed a system of exploitation, forcing accountability and systemic reflection. In the aftermath, the Lawsons reflected on their journey. What began as a personal struggle had transformed into a broader fight for justice, accountability, and the protection of homeowners' rights. They had endured fear, betrayal, and emotional strain, but their unity, determination, and courage had prevailed. Laura spoke at a community meeting following the ruling. "We hope our story serves as a warning and a guide. No one should have to fight alone, and no system should be allowed to exploit those who are vulnerable. Stand up, document, and demand accountability. It works." Mark added, "We fought for our home, but we also fought for fairness, dignity, and justice. And in the end, that fight restored more than just a house. It restored our lives." Evan, now more confident than ever, concluded, "Research, preparation, and persistence can overcome even the most entrenched power. We proved it, and anyone facing injustice can do the same." Maple Ridge Estates would never be the same. The HOA, once untouchable, had been exposed. The Lawsons' victory became a cautionary tale, inspiring homeowners across the region to scrutinize, challenge, and hold their HOAs accountable. And for the first time since the ordeal began, the family could finally breathe, knowing that the home they had fought so fiercely to reclaim was back in their hands. A tangible testament to their resilience, unity, and unyielding pursuit of justice. The day Mark, Laura, and Evan stepped back into their home felt surreal. After months of legal battles, public scrutiny, and personal struggle, the front door, once forcibly taken from them, was finally theirs to open again. The air carried the familiar scent of home, the faint aroma of Laura's favorite candles, the wooden floors warmed by sunlight, and the quiet hum of a house that had been waiting for its family. Mark paused at the doorway, taking in the living room, the walls lined with memories of a life interrupted. "It's really ours again," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Laura wrapped her arms around him, both relief and pride mingling in her embrace. Evan lingered near the staircase, eyes scanning every corner, as if confirming that the life they had built had been restored. The months away had taken their toll, but the Lawsons had emerged stronger. They had endured emotional upheaval, medical crises, and an unprecedented legal fight. Yet their unity, courage, and resilience had turned a story of exploitation into one of triumph. This home, reclaimed against all odds, was more than brick and mortar. It was proof that justice, perseverance, and family could prevail even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The court had mandated restitution. The HOA, forced to acknowledge its wrongdoing, was required not only to return the property but also to cover legal fees, compensate for damages, and provide formal acknowledgement of the procedural violations that had led to the auction. Gerald Fox and the board, once confident and untouchable, now faced both legal consequences and the public scrutiny that had shadowed every step of the process. Their authority in Maple Ridge Estates had been irreparably damaged, and the community they had once controlled with fear and bureaucracy would never again see them as infallible. For the Lawsons, victory carried both joy and reflection. Sitting in the living room, surrounded by boxes of belongings returned from storage, they recounted the journey that had brought them to this moment. Laura spoke first. "I never imagined we would have to fight for our home while Mark was in a coma," she said softly. "But this experience has shown me the power of determination, documentation, and standing together. We can't undo the stress and fear, but we can honor it by being vigilant and advocating for fairness in the future." Mark nodded, his hand resting on hers. "We were blindsided by greed and exploitation, but we refused to be powerless. This house isn't just ours because of the law, it's ours because we never gave up, because we stayed united, and because we demanded accountability. That's what makes this victory meaningful." Evan, now more mature than his years suggested, added, "I learned that knowledge and preparation are powerful tools. You can challenge authority, hold people accountable, and protect what's yours if you stay organized, persistent, and brave. That's a lesson I'll carry forever." The family began the process of restoring the home to its familiar state. Furniture was returned, personal items unpacked, and memories reacquired. Each small detail, a picture frame, a favorite chair, the backyard swing, carried emotional weight, marking the transition from displacement to reclamation. The house, once a symbol of loss and violation, now embodied resilience and justice. Beyond the personal restoration, the Lawsons' battle left a lasting impact on the community. Maple Ridge Estates residents, many previously intimidated by the HOA, were now emboldened. Homeowners began questioning bylaws, reviewing HOA practices, and documenting communications. The fear that had allowed exploitation to persist quietly had been replaced with awareness and vigilance. The Lawson story served as both warning and inspiration. Injustice could be challenged, even in systems designed to suppress dissent. Local news outlets followed up on the resolution of the case. Headlines proclaimed the Lawsons' victory and the HOA's accountability. Family reclaims home after shocking HOA theft. Justice served. Maple Ridge Estates' predatory practices exposed. HOA forced to compensate family after exploiting incapacitated homeowner. The coverage spread across social media, sparking national conversation about homeowner rights and the need for oversight in community associations. Gerald Fox, stripped of authority and facing reputational damage, attempted to maintain a semblance of control in public statements, claiming procedural adherence and regret for misunderstandings. But the overwhelming evidence, media scrutiny, and public outrage rendered his words hollow. For the first time, the facade of infallibility crumbled, leaving the HOA vulnerable to further legal and community challenges. In the quiet of their reclaimed home, the Lawsons reflected on the human cost of the ordeal. Months of uncertainty, worry for Mark's recovery, and financial strain had tested their strength. Yet those same challenges had revealed resilience, solidarity, and the depth of their commitment to one another. The fight for justice had not only restored their property but had also reaffirmed their bond as a family. Laura walked through the backyard, sunlight warming her face. "This house has always been our sanctuary," she said. "We faced a nightmare, but we turned it into a story of hope. That's something no one can take from us." Mark, seated on the porch, watched the leaves rustle in the gentle wind. "We were forced to fight for what was ours," he said. "And in doing so, we've reclaimed more than just a house. We've reclaimed our dignity, our peace, and our faith in fairness." Evan, setting up a small table for homework, reflected on the broader implications. "This isn't just about our family," he said. "It's about showing that when systems fail, persistence, preparation, and courage can restore justice. People need to know they have power, even against authority that seems untouchable." The community slowly began to heal alongside the Lawsons. Conversations about HOA practices sparked reforms, increased transparency, and stronger safeguards for homeowners. Maple Ridge Estates, once a neighborhood marked by fear of bureaucratic overreach, started transforming into a community aware of rights, procedures, and accountability. The Lawson story had created ripple effects far beyond their own household. In the weeks and months that followed, the family settled into a new rhythm. Mark continued his recovery, regaining strength and mobility. Laura returned to her work and volunteer commitments with renewed purpose, often advocating for homeowner rights and sharing their story as a cautionary tale. Evan, inspired by the experience, delved into civic engagement and community advocacy, determined to ensure that no one else would face what they had endured. Reflecting on the journey, the Lawsons understood that their ordeal had changed them irrevocably. They had faced unimaginable stress, medical crises, and the betrayal of trust, yet they emerged not broken, but empowered. Their home was not just a physical space. It was a testament to resilience, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In a quiet moment, the family gathered in the living room, looking around at the home that had been taken and returned. Laura spoke softly. We faced darkness, but we found light. Our story is proof that even when the odds are against you, standing together, being prepared, and never giving up can restore what was lost. Mark nodded, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. We fought for our home, for our family, and for justice. And we won. That victory is ours, and it belongs to everyone who believes in fairness, integrity, and the power of persistence. Evan, smiling faintly, added, and now we can move forward, knowing that no one can take what we've reclaimed. Not our home, not our dignity, not our lives. As the sun set over Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood appeared calm, the streets quiet, the lawns meticulously maintained. Yet beneath the surface, the story of injustice, resilience, and triumph remained etched in the community's memory. The Lawsons had endured, fought, and ultimately prevailed. Their victory was a reminder that even in the face of calculated exploitation, truth, determination, and family unity could restore what was unjustly taken. This chapter, and the story of the Lawsons, concluded not with bitterness or despair, but with empowerment, reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of a family that had faced the worst and emerged victorious. Their home, restored to their hands and hearts, stood as a symbol of hope, a place where justice had been demanded, achieved, and celebrated. If the story shocked you, smash that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because our next video reveals how a HOA demolished a homeowner's addition while the family was on vacation. You won't want to miss it.